The Gail Cutro case is a case no one in our state and across the country will forget. And now we are thankful to be joined by the man who prosecuted the case, Johnny Gasser, and an author who has written a book, In Good Hands. David Heckler joins us now to discuss this. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thank you.
Why do you think this is a case that so many years later still grabs the public and is fascinating and horrifying at the same time?
Well, when this happened, you just don't see something like this happening, particularly in a small city like Columbia, South Carolina. It involved a home daycare woman who was extremely active in her church, Riverland Hills Baptist Church, who had many friends and supporters throughout this whole process. Mm-hmm. And you had 3 children within an 8-month period. One was found deceased. One was definitively shaken to such a point where, unfortunately, he suffered significant brain injuries. And a third little girl that was found, infant, that was found deceased, all within an 8-month period, all in the same room, quite frankly, of a home in Irmo, just a middle-class neighborhood. Where you see kids trick-or-treating and on Halloween, walking to the bus stop, riding their bicycles, people out in the yard playing when the weather's nice. It was so shocking to the greater Columbia community. First when we brought charges against her, and then throughout the multi-year legal process.
And David, this is wild to think, but you were in the courtroom watching Johnny work 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now, in this case. Did you think, as you were watching the trial, that he would get a conviction?
Well, the first time I actually watched the trial, there had been a conviction earlier that was overturned by the South Carolina Supreme Court. So, for sure, it was a possibility. But you can't take anything like that for granted. It was a very difficult case, partly because each of those infants who died had initially been diagnosed as victims of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. And the child who was shaken had a parent, a mother, who was a recovering drug addict, who had had a previous child in her care removed from her custody, and fingers were pointed at her. So it was a complicated case that required Johnny finding witnesses from out of state who could testify against the pathologists who are often the state's best witnesses. Mm-hmm. That made it a really tricky case. Would you agree with that, Johnny?
Absolutely. Those of us, myself and Scarlett Wilson, during the first trial, who was my co-counsel, we weren't exactly the most popular prosecutors in the pathology world in South Carolina at the time. But you're talking about, it was 1993 when these incidents happened. It was 1994, early part of 1994, when we brought charges when the grand jury indicted her, Ms. Cutro. And there were no forensic pediatric pathologists in South Carolina at the time. So we had to go out of state, out of the country, quite frankly. We hired the foremost pediatric pathologist in the United Kingdom. We hired 2 eminently qualified pediatric pathologists, one in Tampa, Florida, one in St. Paul, Minnesota. And then we also had to hire experts in the area of shaken baby. Now, we did have some really good experts at Palmetto Richland Memorial Hospital. But we also, they did not have the broad area of expertise. And so we went to the University of Iowa Medical Center and hired experts, radiologists, and pediatricians to deal with this issue of shaken baby syndrome, because there had not been a shaken baby syndrome prosecution in South Carolina at the time. And so it was very, as David says, it was very complex, and we were plowing new ground from a prosecution and law enforcement perspective.
David, in your book, talking about 2 babies dying in the hands of a daycare owner within 8 months, I think shakes the soul of every parent who has ever left a child at a daycare or with a nanny or with a babysitter or with anybody, even a loved one for that matter. What do you take and what should readers take going forward about the ways to protect our children?
Well, one thing all parents need to understand is that if you're using a home daycare, there is no government agency that's really following each daycare. There are no regulators who are going in and inspecting, asking a lot of questions. In fact, in this case, Gail Cutro, registered, which means that she was one of the few. The estimate I got from the daycare agency was that probably 4/5 of all home daycares are not registered at all. So state doesn't even know they exist.
Right.
So she was one of the 1/5 who actually went that far. But it doesn't mean much. She had 3 references, 3 friends of hers sign a piece of paper. And when the investigation happened because of these deaths and the shaking incident, the social workers who were investigating weren't actually even allowed to go into the house. When they got to the door, they knocked, like you or I would, and Josh Cutro said, "You can't come in." So that's the inspection, even when the state is investigating them. So the lessons here, one of the important lessons here is that every parent should be careful about who they choose for daycare providers, but the choice is the easy part. What you need to do next is drop in unannounced. You need to monitor what's actually going on. Back then, it was a lot harder because there were no cell phones. There was no texting. You couldn't contact other parents and say, "Did you hear about this incident?" or "How are things going with your child?"
Mm-hmm.
There were no nanny cams, which exist today, so that a parent can be sitting at a desk in an office somewhere and see what's going on in the daycare where their children is placed. So it really behooves parents to drop in unannounced and see what's going on and keep track.
Gail Cutro, of course, serving a life sentence here in South Carolina. I know you have been when she is up for parole. Has she ever apologized or admitted to her guilt in this case?
Well, admitted. She did not. So the last 5 times she's appeared for parole hearings, and I haven't been there. I'm not really allowed to be there, but I have listened to the CDs. They're still on CDs. So I can hear what she says and what other people who were with her say. And I think the first time that it was about 10 years ago, when she was asked, "So how do you explain your actions here?" It was the first time she didn't deny. She had previously consistently denied guilt. And on this occasion, for the first time, I think she made a calculation in advance. It was a pause. Everyone waiting to hear what she'd say. She said, "Well, I think my husband was a lot more involved in this than people really understand." So she didn't admit, but she didn't deny. So that constitutes an admission in my book, I guess.
Wow.
And so since then, she's never denied guilt.
And I know you got a chance to speak with the jury after the conviction, Johnny. What did the jury say was the selling moment for them in the case?
The first trial was a conviction, and I was able to talk to some of the jurors afterwards. And the third trial ended in a conviction, and I got to talk to some of the jurors afterwards. The second trial was a hung jury, 11-1,
right,
to convict, and I actually got to talk to several of the jurors that were in the 11 to convict. And in all 3 instances, they really bought the experts that we brought in. They said we're really the key. They needed to know beyond a reasonable doubt that the 2 deceased children were in fact murdered, that they were killed, and they were very impressed with our experts, how they testified, their background certainly, but how they testified and how they could explain the process of shaking a baby or soft suffocation deaths, and so that really was the key, I believe, throughout all 3 of the trials.
All right. And David, you are in town because you have a book signing happening tomorrow at All Good Books for your book. Tell readers a little bit about what they're going to see in the book once they get it.
Sure. So from 6 to 8 a.m., from 6
Here, I'll ask the question again. I'll ask the question again. In fact, I'll just give the
6 to 8
times, 6 to 8.
p.m.
All right. David is actually in town because he has a book signing tomorrow at All Good Books from 6 to 8 p.m. Your book, In Good Hands, what can readers expect?
Well, at the book signing, the signing is the least of it. I'm going to have Johnny Gasser with me, and I'm going to have Patsy Haben-Lytle with me. She was the head of Child Fatalities Department that did the investigation for 7 months and then provided that information to Johnny, and he had to decide whether there was enough there to indict. So we're going to each do some talking. I'm going to read passages from the book. Some of them involve Patsy, some of them involve Johnny, some of them involve other characters in the book who are all people who are involved here, including some of the parents. One parent who was an adamant Cutro supporter, and that's another element here that was very interesting leading up to the trial, that she had a large number of parents who really supported the daycare and got very angry at this man and others who were threatening to close the place down. The judge ultimately had to do that. And one parent who I interviewed 2.5 years after the first conviction, I knock on the door, planned to go in. She invited me in. Almost the first words out of her mouth were, "I can't believe I was so stupid."
Oh.
She still supported Gail Cutro in some sense. She couldn't really understand why she'd been convicted, but she did understand that she had no business bringing her child back to the daycare after 2 children had died and one had suffered a brain injury. She felt like I was misguided. I felt like this was my friend and I had to support her. But really, my obligation was to do what was best and safest emotionally and physically for my son, and that wasn't what I did. So that was, I'm going to read from that passage where we're finding out some of the parents who were the most vocal supporters had a chance to think it over again and would have done something very different if they'd been in the situation again.
All right. Well, the book is In Good Hands. So important to learn from the past moving forward. David Heckler, again, tomorrow is going to be at All Good Books from 6 to 8. Johnny Gasser, the prosecutor in this case, will be there as well. Thank you both for being with us today.
Thank
you,
you.
Andrea.